Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm your host, Recommend. And today we're going to be talking about the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance, specifically the games, such as this one here in my modded Game Boy, DMG01 model, and the Game Boy Advance, such as this one. This is my SP model. So specifically, when you have these Game Boys, you go outside, you have some fun, and you come home, you may not want to sit there and play on a small screen. You may want to sit at home and play it on your large 50-inch plus screen. So it is possible these days, and it's relatively affordable depending on what you're willing to settle for. There's quite a few options these days. Some of the more pricey options you may want to steer clear of, but generally we're going to be going over 3 or 4 options here with the consoles that I have personally, and I think they're pretty affordable for the average person. Nothing should really go past, let's say, I guess you say $150 for the actual equipment. The games are a different story, depending on the games that you want. Games are getting pretty pricey these days, especially if you're a retro collector like I am. So, without further ado, let's start with the first one. Alright, so option 1 is an actual Super Nintendo. So if you can still find one these days, they normally go about $50 depending on where you look, and usually you can find them at garage sales. You can go on eBay, Amazon. Hopefully somebody's grandma or mom has one that they just want to give away. Take your pick. Try to find one. You can also go to retro stores and try to find them, but they generally look like this in case you're not familiar with a Super Nintendo. And here's the Game Boy, Super Game Boy player. So this is your first option here. It's actually a really good option. It plays all the original Game Boy games. It doesn't play Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance games. So this is strictly for those of you that want to play original Game Boy, black and white, and some of the later Game Boy games, but nothing with color, nothing that's Game Boy Color only. It won't play those at all. But it's still a good option. You do get a border on the screen because it tries to keep the aspect ratio of the original system. So just keep that in mind. And the great thing about this and what makes this an awesome option is, if you look at the back of the Super Nintendo here, see if I get the focus on camera, it's a multi-AV out for the Super Nintendo. So the great thing about this one is, whatever cable you use will improve the quality of the picture of the Super Game Boy itself. For example, if you're just using normal AV cables, you're going to get composite video out, and it looks okay depending. If you're using a CRT, let me rephrase that. If you're using a CRT, it looks okay. If you're using an HDTV, maybe not so much. Depends on your TV's built-in upscaler, but can't hurt to try. And those are the cheapest cables you can possibly get. But something to remember is, if you have an S-Video cable and you have a CRT, it's gonna look great. It's gonna be nice and sharp and crispy. Most HDTVs now do not come with S-Video cable, S-Video ports, unfortunately. That could be a problem, but if yours does, definitely go for it. And then finally, although the cables are very rare these days, and they are going to make some more eventually, but if you can find them, I definitely would say go with getting them if you can find them. HD Retrovision does have component cables for the Super Nintendo, and that means that you can actually get component out of the Super Game Boy, which gives you an amazing picture. Definitely a highly recommended way to go ahead and play this, the Game Boy on your TV. Unfortunately, the only problem is with the component cables for the Super Nintendo is that they give you pure 240p RGB out over the component, and not all HDTVs really support that. Supposedly the ones that have the best compatibility seem to be Samsung TVs, so that could be a little bit of a problem. But if you have an older CRT with component inputs, then it's gonna look phenomenal, and it's a definite recommend. So go for that one. Now let's move on to the next one. And guys, the next option is, ta-da, still a Super Nintendo, but this time you can actually get Retrobit's Super Retro Advance adapter, and this will actually let you play Game Boy Advance games on your Super Nintendo. And let me rephrase that a little bit. You can play through your Super Nintendo, but not on your Super Nintendo. Now, what I mean by that is, unlike the Super Game Boy here, this actually goes through the video output as we spoke about earlier. Sadly, this does not use the video output of the Super Nintendo. It does have its own. So if you look on this side, you see there's an AV out port there. So it's a normal phono jack, 3.5 millimeter jack. Now you plug this in. You plug in the 3.5 millimeter jack, and it goes out into composite video. And that's unfortunately the weakness of this solution, is that you only get composite out. Although the picture for it does not look bad, it's actually pretty decent. It's a decent picture for composite video. Another thing is, this is actually the opposite of the Super Game Boy. So this one will play all your Game Boy Advance games, but it will not play your normal Game Boy games. So you're kind of stuck in between, between a rock and a hard place there. If you have both adapters, obviously you can play most games. But funny enough, you still can't play the Game Boy Color games because neither one will support the Game Boy Color games. But it's still a good option if you just want a nice cheap way to play your Game Boy Advance games on your TV. You get a pretty decent picture. It's fairly affordable. I think I paid maybe $40 for this, $25 to $40. It wasn't very expensive at all, and it lets you play, of course, with your Super Nintendo controllers. And it actually has the Game Boy extension cable for the links. I guess you can link you can switch Pokemon and all that good stuff. Sadly, again, it will not be using the multi-AV out. It will only stick to it would only use its own video cables there. Now there is a slight exception to this, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So this is your next option, a Super Retro Trio. Now with the Super Retro Trio, you can use the Super Retro Advance adapter, and it'll actually route the video directly to the console itself. You don't have to use the AV port. It'll actually use the built-in AV ports in the back. And as you see, there's standard RCA jacks, which give you a normal composite video, and there's an S-video port there as well. The problem again is this will not output S-video or any kind of RGB. I believe there's a way it can be modded to do it, but I mean, that's out of my skill range and out of most people's skill range. And you really have to know what you're doing in order to do that, because you'll destroy the piece if you go ahead and do it wrong. But it's a great option. It's pretty clean, relatively clean if you think about it. Just plug it, just insert it like a regular cartridge, and you can just play your games the regular old way. Play it like a regular console. Another great thing is, let me see if I can get this open for you guys. Alright, so here we're back again. So you do have the option to play, but you can only really play with either the Super Nintendo controllers or the Genesis jacks on this system. Now, don't panic just because I'm saying Genesis, because the good thing about the Super Retro Trio is the controllers that it comes with look and feel very close to actual Super Nintendo controllers, but they do end in Genesis jacks for some strange reason. But it works. So if you plug it into your actual Sega Genesis, you can fool your friends and tell them you're playing a really fast Super Nintendo. But it's a nice option to have. And yet another option in your arsenal of playing Game Boy Advance games on your TV. So of course, you can still use the Super Game Boy on the Super Retro Trio. And it's a regular plug and play. Pop it in, use your controllers, put it in your TV, you'll be a happy person. Just remember that it tops out at S-Video and not RGB like on the actual Super Nintendo if you have the HD Retrovision cables. Now just remember, the Super Retro Advance doesn't actually need AV cables on this one, unlike on the Super Nintendo. So I know it's a little confusing, but it makes perfect sense if you actually have the system in front of you. But they're both pretty good ways of playing the systems if you're playing particularly on a CRT. And even if you're playing on a HDTV, you still get a pretty good clean signal. Of course, it's just not going to be HD. These systems output at 240p, and your HDTV will probably recognize it as 480i. So it doesn't give you quite as crisp a picture as you would probably like, but it still works and you can still enjoy the game. Just remember, turn on the gaming mode and turn off any extra processing in your TV to get the best results. Let's go on to the next option. The next best option, of course, is the GameCube player. So if you're not familiar with the GameCube, it looks like this. It doesn't come stock with a GameCube, so you actually have to buy a GameCube or already own a GameCube and then buy the Game Boy player. The Game Boy player itself has a little mini disc you pop into the top, and it actually lets you access the software for the actual Game Boy player. The Game Boy player has technically all the stock hardware of an actual Game Boy Advance, but the disc is actually to let you interface with that firmware. So the great thing about this is, of course, that you can actually play pretty much every Game Boy game. So you can play all the Game Boy games or the Game Boy Color games, and finally your Game Boy Advance games. So you pop it in there, fits in nicely. You can use your wireless controllers like the Wavebird if you have it for the GameCube, and it's a good option. As well as you can play it under composite video, standard AV. You can use S-Video, and if you have the component cables, I was lucky enough to get them while they were still relatively affordable. It's probably the best option you can have using actual hardware to actually play the systems. The GameCube component cables unfortunately go anywhere from $250 on the cheap side and all the way up to $400 generally. So you may want to stick with S-Video as your best option with this, because it's still S-Video cables are dirt cheap for any of these systems. And the great thing about the S-Video is, since the GameCube uses the same multi-AV jack as the Super Nintendo, the cables are actually interchangeable. So you can use the same AV cables on the Super Nintendo and the GameCube, and even an N64. So just something to keep in mind. That might save you a couple of bucks if you're planning on having the systems, or you already have the systems but you're using a particular cable. The cable can be shared. The component cable is the only one that cannot. It has a very specific connection, a digital AV out. This connection is not even on every GameCube. So if you're gonna buy a GameCube to play Game Boy Advance games and you want component video, you have to make sure that it has this connection. Nintendo took it out of later revision models, and you'll be stuck with only S-Video to top out. Maybe SCART if you're willing to go that route. But overall, it's a great option. Between the three options we spoke about earlier, between the Super Nintendo option is you get RGB with the original Game Boy. You only get AV quality with the Super Retro Trio, and you do have a border with the regular Game Boy, Super Game Boy player. You don't have a border with the Retro Advance, which is something I forgot to mention earlier. It actually does fill up your entire screen, and that's on both the Super Nintendo and the Super Retro Trio. You can use the Super Game Boy Advance, or Super Retro Advance, excuse me, and you can play your Game Boy games in full screen, or your Game Boy Advance games in full screen. With the GameCube player, like the original Super Game Boy, it will play in a border. Now you can stretch the picture, but it's not going to look as clear or as crisp, but it's an option for you. Personally, I don't have a problem with the border anymore. I used to when I was younger and I didn't know any better, but now that I know what I'm looking at, when it stretches the pixels, it doesn't look good to me. I don't enjoy the picture. But if you keep it on the sharp filter and you keep it on the smaller side, the GameCube Game Boy player is probably the best option you can get, especially if you have S-Video or above, because it'll play pretty much anything you throw at it, and it's a great way to play. Also, you do have, like I said, if you had the Wavebird controller, you do have wireless options. Now, there's wireless options for the original Super Nintendo and the Super Retro Trio as well. You can get options from 8-Bit Do, who make awesome Bluetooth controllers and dongles, and Retrobit themselves offer a RF version of their own Super Nintendo controllers that work with both consoles, so that will be up to you. But you do have wireless options, so you can play far away from your TV with any of the three options that I showed you so far. Now, let's move on to the next one, and probably the final one. The final option that I like to use is the Retron 5, which, here it goes. Now, the Retron 5 is sort of let's just say it's sort of in between in terms of a hardware and software solution. It does let you play your hardware cartridges, so you're not using ROMs generally, but it uses emulation. So it runs on an Android. It's like your phone, it runs on Android, and it has a custom OS over it, and it'll let you play your actual Game Boy games. It'll let you play your Game Boy Color, and your Game Boy Advance games, just like the GameCube player does. And on top of that, it will upscale them to 720p, and they look very sharp, very crisp. They look generally pretty good. It depends on the game, of course. You can also use scan lines. You can use pretty much any controller you like. So you can use a Genesis controller if you want to play that way. You can use a Game Boy. You can use a Nintendo controller. You can use a Super Nintendo controller. You can use the wireless controller that comes with this system, although I wouldn't suggest it because that controller is terrible. And you can actually use 8-bit do controllers with it. So you do have a lot of options with this. 720p picture, HDMI out, which is very nice. You cannot play this on a CRT if you do have a CRT, unlike the last 3 options that I showed you, because it only has HDMI out. Something else to keep in mind. But overall, it's not a bad option. This generally costs somewhere between $100 to $150, normally between $115 to $125. And you also get all the options of all these other consoles here that you can play. It's not a bad system. Playable for most people. Now, the bad thing about this one is, unfortunately, that when you're playing your game, you do get a little more lag with this version as compared to all the hardware options that I showed you earlier, because it's emulating. So, the game goes to this rips the game into something called a ROM. Think about it as when you rip your CDs into MP3s. Then the system keeps that ROM in memory. Then that ROM actually has to go to another layer, which is called an emulator. The emulator basically tells this system to pretend that it's a Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, and then from there, it starts processing your input and all that stuff, and it goes through it. All your software has to be, everything you do has to be processed through software. It's not just a normal hardware encoded thing where everything's instantaneous. So something to keep in mind. Generally, won't bother most people. Most Game Boy games play fairly slowly anyway, so you'll be fine. If you're playing role-playing games, it probably won't matter at all. But it's a great option, and one that's fairly affordable. And you do get the cleanest picture out of all the options with this. So another option to keep in mind. Retron 5.
Overall, with our 4 contenders, there should only be one winner.
But these solutions are all so radically different that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. My recommendation for people who are just getting into the hobby is the Retron 5 because of its simple setup and wealth of options. For collectors that already have the gear, any of the other options will do just fine, with the GameCube player as the most versatile. Thank you for watching, and I greatly appreciate it if you'd shared and subscribed to my channel. Don't forget to click on that thumbs up icon, every little bit helps. This again is Recommend. Have a great day. Adios.